Now, this brings me to a tremendous pleasure. I think I met Don Dryden for the first time in the late 90s and have seen him many times since at various functions. But one of the things that occurred one of the first times we met is, you read Langer. And you read Langer. And it's like, this is not so common in philosophy circles in the United States. However, I would say it's getting better. It's improving by increments among the philosophers. And of course, as we've all discovered in the Langer circle, Langer is read in all these different disciplines, and philosophy in some ways is only just tinily beginning to catch up with Langer. Because she was so unconventional in her time, so creative in her thinking. Well, there's somebody in this room who knew Langer. There's somebody in this room who took a canoe trip with Langer. There's somebody in this room who knows more about Langer than any of us ever will, possible exception of our dear colleague from Harvard, who is probably on your heels, Don. Carolyn Bergonzo is going to talk about that. But in any case, so Don has been, how long have you got curious about her back in the late 60s?
1965. It was a course.
Mid-60s. Don is, he looks young, doesn't he? So anyway, in some ways, I think that he just has to be regarded as our Dr. Vater for all Langer studies. And so that's part of the reason that it's such a pleasure to have him here and to introduce him. And so now that you all know how far back his studies of Langer go, that means for those of you, especially the young ones who are curious, Don will be around all week, and you can corner him. You can tackle him. I saw a floor tackle him this morning, and so he can be caught and he can be tackled, and ask him questions about Langer herself and about her family and about her development and about Don's own development. But rather than dwell too long on this, I have to say that this is just a rare pleasure, and I think you'll all agree to have Don Dryden among us to give the keynote lecture for the Creativity Conference. For those of you who were in Frankfurt, this looks like a continuation of that work. And so in any case, Don, come up here and
Okay. Yeah, what happened was, and I think Bob Innes beats me by a year, but when I was a junior at college, and I was taking I was a German major, so I was taking a literature course, and the professor who taught it, who actually didn't die that long ago, it was in 2020, I was really surprised. He lived a long time, but he was a poet and a translator from German poetry, but he also was a German instructor, and I was taking his course in literature, and one day I just happened to say, you know, if I had to name one book that I would take with me on a desert island, it would be Philosophy in a New Key. And I thought, what's that? So, of course, because I admired him a great deal, I went to the college bookstore and I picked up one of those 50-cent Mentor paperbacks that was available then. And as I said in my bio sketch, I've carried the torch ever since, because it was really life-changing experience.
Who was your instructor?
His name was Stuart Freebert.
Stuart Freebert.
Yeah. Yeah, I just learned that he died only in 2020, so that was quite extraordinary. So I don't have as many slides as I would like to have, but I have a few good slides, I think, and the rest I have to work on. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to retell the story of how the project of mine formed in her own mind, and how she carried it out. And then I'll take a look at some misunderstanding about that some of the critics at the time who reviewed her book had about what she was trying to do. And I don't think very many people really realized, maybe some still don't realize, how much she saw this. And in her own words, she said, it's a scientific line of inquiry. So I'll talk about that, and then I'll talk about how, even though she said it was scientific, that was when she was irked and pressed. But she knew well and repeatedly expressed that science and philosophy were inseparable because every science needs its concepts. And if the concepts aren't there, they haven't been created yet, then the science can't get off the ground. And the only way, however, she would say, to form the right concepts for a scientific discipline is to know enough about the discipline to know what the concept has to do. So I'll talk something about that. And then this last part is a mystery. I mean, not a mystery, but when I was writing my dissertation, which was started in 1998 and finished in 2006, some changes were beginning both in philosophy of science, and in the biological sciences. And as I was working on my dissertation, I began to get hints of what later became systems biology. And I began to suspect that there might be some really interesting links between what was happening in systems biology, or what I expected to happen in systems biology, and in fact did happen or is happening, and the project of mind, how Langer engaged the biological sciences and what things she chose to emphasize and what things she chose to build her abstractions on. So I'll get to that. So I'll start with more familiar territory and try to move into this. So Langer is pretty straightforward about the path that she took. As she explained in the introduction to the first volume of Mind, she wrote that she began in recognizing the keynote in Philosophy in a New Key, that was the central importance of symbolism as the characteristically human element in cognition. And she argued at the time that was what brought about a great departure of human beings from animal mentality. Now, in talking about this, I'll just make an aside here, is that we're stuck with a word which I wish there was another word, but we don't have one. And the word symbol carries such a baggage of meanings from common usage that interfere constantly with how she used that word, and how Cassirer, I guess, used it and intended it, that I almost cringe every time I have to say symbol. But anyway, so she moved from there, and she picked up on what she called the influence of particular symbolic formulations on the very data of knowledge. This led her to follow the footsteps of people that she admired greatly, including Ernst Cassirer, but also Charles Peirce, and took her on a journey of exploring all the different modes of symbolism, and in fact how what she called symbolic capacities shaped and formulated our understanding of the world, even our perception. So in the course of this writing, Philosophy in a New Key, she arrived at, or began, or came very close to a concept of art as what she called the symbolic expression of an artist's knowledge of feeling. And in fact, she herself dropped the word symbol in her, I think the definition that she most preferred, which was forms expressive of human feeling, and dropped the word symbol. But anyway, and she then picked up the ball and carried it through to completion in writing Feeling and Form, which was a very detailed and comprehensive theory of the arts. But she reports that at the end of that book, She was bothered by a question which she never answered and, in fact, never even raised, but she regarded as fundamental. It was the question, why must artistic form, in order to be expressive of feeling, always be so-called living form? She acknowledged, and she knew and was comfortable saying that organic or living form was characteristic of works of art. But that was a mode of appearance of the works, because artistic works of art, in order to can be expressive of feeling, and in fact need to appear living in some way, but they're not, of course, alive. She acknowledged also that even Aristotle had observed that organic form was the most important feature of any artistic composition, but that he also noted that art must only seem and not actually be lifelike. Why? She asked. And in order to answer that question, she embarked on the journey that took her through what occupied the second half of her entire intellectual career. As she realized, she began to realize that she was facing a fairly extensive study. I think she underestimated it, but she realized that she would have to not only start studying actual living form, as biologists find it, but also the actual phenomena of feeling. And she remarked, we have at present no scientific access to that. And she was entirely correct. As a result of these studies, an ambitious project became clearer in her thinking, and she realized that one of the goals that she had was to support what she called that she was undertaking a process of conceptual reconstruction that would, in her mind, support exact, detailed, and systematic knowledge of biology and of felt experience that would also articulate with the existing relevant sciences and would lead us towards systematic insight into the nature of life and especially of mind. She also mentioned, and she made an argument about this, but I won't go into it, why she thought that the work of constructing an adequate conceptual framework was an assignment that was primarily for philosophers, even though she acknowledged that every time a well-known scientist in the field has done similar work, what they're doing is philosophical labor. So she began, because she realized that, she said, works of art are images of the forms of feeling. And two, expressive form is always organic or living form. For her, that made the biological foundation of feeling possible. And so she recognized that also that in an artist's projection, feeling is always a heightened form of life. So any work that expresses felt various kinds of aspects of feeling or subjective life must also express the unfelt substructure of vital processes. And that goes all the way down to the bottom of living process. And she realized that if vitality and feeling are conceived in this way, there's no sharp break, no metaphysical gap between physical and mental realities. Although there are thresholds in the course of evolution when, say, sentience first appears, or when human mentality transcends the animal level. And she realized that one of the things that faces anybody who wants to do this kind of conceptual work, even empirical work, you have to have some image of the phenomenon that you're studying. She believed that images are what hold a phenomena, which give us our first understandings of something, because we have to have some kind of image of the phenomenon in order to study it and refine our understandings and refine our concepts. One of the problems, of course, is that feeling is something that's available only within the organism in which it occurs. So we can't easily have access and form an image of what it is, the way we can to all kinds of things in the world. which is why the physical sciences took off so early and were so far ahead of psychology. But she realized then that because of this lack of images, psychology had reached an impasse, that feeling was in fact the defining subject matter of psychology, had been recognized as such. Consciousness or subjective experience had been recognized for almost 2,000 years as the proper subject matter of something called psychology. Although the name itself was only appeared in the 15th century, but that's quite a long time ago still. But anyway, so she realized that because works of art are images of the forms of feeling, they're giving us images of the phenomenon that psychologists are interested in coming to understand and investigate. And because the works of art can rise to the expression of every aspect of felt experience, including, she said, the highest aspects of human personality. And what was great about that was that the works of art, therefore, because they're images of the forms of feeling, they give us the images that we need to suggest concepts about the nature of feeling. And because feeling is a biological phenomena, they suggest concepts for the substructure of feeling, out of which feeling emerges. That's the biological, underpinnings of which feeling is a phase. And she also realized then that the works of art serve as a touchstone and something against which we can measure the adequacy of the concepts that we put forward and serve as a constant check on the work that we're involved in. As she said, but then she went on to say that that a philosopher who's guided by the image of feeling and life that's contained in works of art does not deprecate physical mechanisms, but seeks more and more of them as the subtlety of the phenomena increase. So we'll see that in her mind, she said, the better one knows the forms of feeling, the more there is to account for in the literal, sober terms of biological thinking. So that brings us, oops, no, I'll just do this. Wait a minute. Whoops. Oh, yeah, I see. All right. So I'm going to speak down to how she understood what it was that she was trying to do. She clearly understood the project of mind primarily as a contribution to psychology and the biological sciences. But in a review of the first volume of Mind in the Saturday Review, it was published in July of 1967, there is an English art critic, who some of you may know, Sir Herbert Reed, who was not only an art critic, he was a poet, he was a historian of art, and he was also an anarchist philosopher. A very interesting fellow. And she had exchanges of letters with him going back at least into the 1950s because they shared an interest in art. But he wrote in his review of the first volume of Mind, he described the purpose of her work as metaphysical and added, Dr. Langer has the ambition to present a new philosophical system. Well, according to one of Langer's friends, Wes Weir, Langer was incensed when she read that. And she told him, I should think that by now, Sir Herbert would know the difference between a metaphysical system and a scientific line of inquiry. Well, we'll find out that it was in fact metaphysical, but in the moment I can see why she said what she said. So in response to that criticism, she made a concerted effort to correct what she referred to as a serious misrepresentation of my purpose. So she wrote letters to Sir Herbert Reed. She wrote a letter to the book review editor of the Saturday Review, and her letter was published. And she gave an extended interview with the writer James Lord, who was best known, I think, for writing a biography of Giacometti. But anyway, that was published in the New York Times Book Review. Also, no, it was in summer of 1968. And in the course of that, she was able to state her purpose with clarity and directness, which she was quite capable of doing. And I believe, and I think you will too, that she leaves no room for doubt about what she was doing. As she said, this correspondence with the book review editor and Sir Herbert Reed, she wrote, what I'm trying to do is break through the limitations of current forms of thought in biology and to construct a conceptual framework for all biological thinking that will connect its several departments from biochemistry to neuropsychology in one scientific, and that was italicized, system, which will naturally result in a theory of the human mind. My aim is to tie together a number of disciplines into a structure that these disciplines, the arts, biology, neuroscience, psychology, anthropology, and many others, won't themselves singly support by developing basic concepts which underlie all of these sciences and which can rule the thought of every one of them. Then she continued, my current work, and this was one of Sir Herbert's misunderstandings as well. He thought, well, she said, my current work is not specifically concerned with the arts. It is not simply an extension of what I said in Feeling and Form. The 4 chapters on art that make up the second part of the book have only an orienting function. Basic concepts, wait a minute, where are we? Yes, in fact, the book is not on art at all, she said, except insofar as my biological concepts stem from art. It is certainly not metaphysical, she said, and though the work of constructing a conceptual framework is certainly philosophical, it does not commit one to any philosophical system, old or new. That's Sir Herbert again. He died in 1968, by the way, so the year after that. So that brings us to the third part, which is, how can the purpose of mind, which was clearly in her eyes at once scientific and philosophical, how can we make sense out of that? Well, she begins by arguing, at present, we have no scientific access to actual phenomena of feeling. Most creatures, certainly the higher animals, are sentient. She thought that was just common sense. They feel their own activity and the impingements of the world around them. And this is really what distinguishes these creatures from inanimate mechanisms, however elaborate, and even from such animate ones as plants, which probably do not feel the influences controlling their lives or their own responses. And just a footnote here, in Lona's volume, the Bloomsbury Handbook of Langer, I hope that I've settled once and for all the question of what feeling meant for Langer. And if anyone, the clue is in a I'll just make that as a passing footnote, is that there's a footnote in the chapter on feeling in which she mentions, but only in passing, and it's in a footnote. She said, I use feeling the way, no, she said, William James in the Principles of Psychology used thought the way I use feeling. And that references several pages in the Principles of Philosophy where James discusses the problem he faces as a psychologist, which is there's no really good generic term to cover all the aspects of subjective experience. Everything we can experience, their thoughts and feelings, emotions, sensations, they're all kinds of things, right? But there's no good word that stands for all of them. And he ended up saying, well, I think I'll use thought because that's as good as any. But what's interesting is then in the when he published an abridged version of the principles 2 years later, he changed a number of things. He stopped using thought for the most part, and he substituted the word consciousness or subjective experience as the subject of psychology and what it was he thought was the proper focus of that science. So Langer, whenever you see Langer's term feeling, again, feeling, it's like the word symbol. You know, it carries such a heavy load of common usage that it's difficult to remember or think what. So here's the Oxford English Dictionary definition. The most common meaning of feeling is a generic term comprising sensation, desire, and emotion, but excluding perception and thought. So Langer did not mean that, but that's a common meaning. That's the point. So anyway, so we work against that in using that term. Anyway, so the higher animals are sentient. But at the time she was working on mind, which was roughly from the mid-1950s until the early 80s, behaviorism of some sort and degree had become the most respectable position in psychology, as she acknowledges and as anybody who lived through that period will remember. She said behaviorism was defined by the programmatic refusal to accept anything except overt behavior as a psychological datum. Some behaviorists even went so far as to deny the existence of inward experience, while others only excluded it from scientific study. In fact, one thing I remember is that behaviorism came to exert such a powerful influence, at least in the United States, that psychology, sociology, political science, and a number of other fields were renamed behavioral sciences. It was quite a lot of them, and as a result, not only that, but buildings were renamed from psychology building to the behavioral sciences building, programs at universities. I think the University of Chicago was one example. They had a behavioral sciences program then, which included a lot of these kinds of disciplines. But Langer thought the methods of this so-called psychology are all evasion and circumvention of traditional terms and of the untenable assumptions that these terms express. As a result of these restrictions, the psychologist is not free to use his scientific imagination because the edges of his field are carefully staked out and blocked with warnings against quagmires and pitfalls of the wrong isms. And as I said before, William James had defined psychology as the science of mental life, the phenomena of which include, in James's words, such things as we call feelings, desires, cogitations, reasonings, decisions, and the like. But as I said, 2 years later, he redefined psychology then as the description and explanation of states of consciousness as such. Langer recognized that these problems that caused the impasse in psychology were, as she said, deep-seated and conceptual. And for its own development as a science, psychology needed to refashion, reconstruct its conception, its concepts, making a framework strong enough to give negotiable meanings to such terms as subjective, felt, conscious, mental, and the topic itself, which is mind. But psychology at the time was unable to deal, she said, with its own essential subject matter. Then she made, on several occasions, looking at the history of science, she argued that in general sciences are born of philosophy, in the sense that they don't simply arise from uncontrolled observation. They don't arise from uncontrolled observation when philosophy is finally slain and cleared away to prevent their growth. They're born under very special conditions, namely when their key concepts reach a degree of abstraction and precision which makes them adequate to the demands of exact systematic thought. One example she pointed to, again, on several occasions, was Newton's concept of gravity as a property of matter. But I think even more basic than that was his concept of mass. Because without the concept of mass, physics would never have gotten started. So Langer believed that we operate with these basic concepts and that they influence the very terms in which facts are expressed. They even influence our observations. And if it happens that our basic concepts don't fit properly whatever aspects of reality we want to talk about and study, then we get stuck in quagmires of all kinds. Then she mentioned again that she thought it was really the work of philosophers to undertake this kind of challenge, in part because scientists were so busy with their own research, they couldn't really take the time to do the wide reading, not only in the special sciences, but sciences outside their own, as well as readings in philosophy and so forth, which you would need to do in order to do this work. So she believed then that there were two fundamental assumptions that would need to be changed, and these were metaphysical, in her own words, because they deal with the basic assumptions implicit in our formulations of fact. The first was that life is essentially a process. This is a book, oops. It's not going to do it. Let's see. There we go. A book that came out a few years ago, the English philosopher of science, John Dupre, who argues about life is essentially process, but I think he draws some wrong conclusions from that, as I hope to make clearer later.
He doesn't answer his emails either.
I had that experience many years ago.
And he doesn't acknowledge he's got an intellectual entity.
Anyway, sorry.
Uh-huh. Yeah, no, you're right. That was frustrating. Anyway, so that was that life is essentially a process, and she was very impressed by the fact that, as she put it, although living things exhibit stable, enduring shapes, their material composition is changing all the time, and what gives the organism its stable form is a profound functional integration of billions of intricate, distinct activities found at every level, from the cell to entire physiological systems, coordinated with each other in ways that seem a miracle of timing and complementation. They form a single system that appears to be inviolable and is inviolable because if it's interfered with, it's destroyed. But she says a living thing is actually a dynamic whole, which is a whole held together only by its own activity. It's a process of continuous change in which permanence of form is perpetually being achieved and is always at every moment an achievement because it depends entirely on the activity of the organism itself. But then, so what she drew from that, the conclusion was that if you want to avoid some kind of uncritical holism, which she criticized for treating life as unanalyzable, you have to come up with some kind of appropriate units of analysis if you're going to probe into the details of this miraculous, unceasing process. So if the essential feature of what we call life is in fact incessant change or process, manifesting itself in dynamic wholes, then the proper analytic units must be events of some kind. But if it's also to function as an analytic unit, these events have to be something that can be empirically found in the material of biology. And although biology, the biological processes seem to present as a continuum of events, that she believed that we can distinguish episodes in this continuum which she called acts, that they have a distinguishable dynamic structure which repeats itself in every recurrence of this kind of event and at every level, from the level of behavior, even to social behavior, all the way down to the boundary line between life and non-living organic chemistry. She did note, however, that working biologists frequently employ this term, but haven't really paid much attention to what it means, which is sort of interesting. In other words, biologists throw the term around, act, to talk about what they're seeing at every level. But, you know, it's not a systematic use of the term. It's just something that you find, she said, and it seems to be very common. And the second fundamental assumption that she made was, and this is also metaphysical, in the same sense, is that feeling is not an entity or a thing which is produced by biological activity. It's actually a phase of activity itself. To assume that feelings, sensations, and so forth are terms or entities of any kind produced by physiological processes or entirely independent of them was a basic metaphysical fallacy. So those were the two sort of keynote, the two like fundamental building blocks on which she reconstructed. Wait, I don't want to be there yet. Huh. Oh, all right, this is where I want to be. Sorry. The next part that I'm going to talk about is maybe a little bit harder to follow and is wide open to misunderstanding, because here's another term, like symbol and feeling, which carries such powerful history of common usage and understanding that it's difficult to use it again without choking, and that's the term mechanism. And I'll say a little more about that. Because she also noted, hold on. So here again, she's looking at the vocabulary that's actually used commonly by working biologists, and notices that one word that appears frequently and ubiquitously, in fact, in all journals, conference presentations, and discussions is the word mechanism. She further pointed out that for many philosophers who are trying to understand the essence of mind or the essence of life, and again, this was in mid-20th century, felt threatened that the use of the term mechanism would impose the image of l'homme machine on their thinking and would limit the kind of adequate appreciation for what such people believe really was important about living things. And so they retreat to some kind of anti-mechanism or other. And she said, well, for those people, they're working with an ideal of mechanism which goes all the way back at least as far as the 16th and 17th centuries. The image is one of a machine made of prefabricated, inert parts, powered from a single source outside of itself, originating and designed to perform preformed tasks by a set of interlocking movements, and that was alarming. And I think for many of you, and I feel it too, it's like another of those words when I use it, and there isn't a better word for it that I've come up with yet. Anyway, it's hard not to choke on it. I doubt if there are as many philosophers who would today consider themselves to be strictly anti-mechanists, but it's likely that talk of mechanisms in connection with life and mind makes many people uncomfortable, myself included. But Langer reminds us once again, and I think this is a very interesting observation. She pointed out that neither the professional philosophers who concern themselves with the nature of life and mind, nor the philosophizing scientists themselves have looked to the actual vocabulary used by working scientists for the kinds of concepts that biological sciences actually work with. For one thing, she observed that working biologists are quite clearly bent on the discovery and understanding of mechanisms, expect to trace acts to purely physical origins, and they also regard both acts and mechanisms as natural phenomena, which means that the realm of life is continuous with the vastly greater realm of inanimate nature. But remember, Langer allows for thresholds, even if there's a continuity. She concludes, in fact, then, that she finds it strange that two principles which many philosophically minded thinkers had found conflicting were systematically and happily joined by most scientific studies of life and mind. So working biologists were happy to talk about acts and talk about mechanisms. And I'll say more about that later. So she said, if, in fact, the concepts of mechanism and act seem antithetic in philosophy, one or the other of them is probably misconceived. And further noted, and this is also, you'll see, it was quite accurate observation, which is the concept of mechanism has not received any critical treatment or careful definition from any thinkers. That was in the 1960s. And that remained so actually until the 1990s. That's a later story. So she provided a working definition, at least didn't perform the extensive analysis herself, but provided as a working definition, mechanism is any process we understand in terms of physics and chemistry. But she adds immediately, the analysis of acts leads one not to inert, permanent bits of matter being rearranged by impinging forces, but to further and further acts, subsumed under almost any act with which one chooses empirically to begin. At length, present-day researchers even reach a level of proto-acts, which belong to chemistry as much as biology, apparently, but they also exemplify some of the properties of acts, but not all of them. And continues, the complexity of such processes is beyond the imagination of anyone who does not know some samples of them rather intimately. They grow up into self-sustaining rhythms, dialectical exchanges of energy, forms and qualities evolving and resolving, submicroscopic elements already highly structured, emerging, and great dynamisms emerging. The commonplace tenets that such products of nature cannot attain feeling, awareness, and thought loses its cogency when one is confronted by the actual intricacies of chemical and biochemical organization. The bridge to organism arises of itself, and the conviction that the extended substance cannot think, and thinking substance cannot have material properties, appears as a medieval doctrine handed down to modern philosophy from Descartes, and with no firmer foundation than his word. So she was quite happy operating with the concept of mechanism, and as we'll see, things have changed a great deal since the time that she wrote. So, oops. All right, the new mechanical philosophy. So I'm going to set Langer's work aside for a bit, although I'll return to it in the end. But for now, I want to consider the emergence over the past 3 decades of something that has been called the new mechanical philosophy. One of the claims of philosophers who've taken up this new research program and studying sciences is that, and this was something Langer also pointed out, was that the concept of mechanism has not received critical treatment or careful definition. And in fact, many of the philosophers who have worked in this area said as much. So what's this mechanistic philosophy, and what does it mean in current context? Well, there's the Greek tradition of atomism, in which the explanation of macroscopic objects are made in terms of constituent elementary particles, or atoms. The atomists characterized these atoms in terms of their shape and size and motion, but those were the only properties that they thought worked together to create the things that we see. Well, the atomic theory went into eclipse until the 17th and 18th century, when it was revived by people like Galileo, Descartes, Boyle, Newton, and so forth. Descartes said, for example, "I've described this earth, and indeed the whole universe, as if it were a machine. I've considered only various shapes and movements of its parts." And furthermore, Descartes allowed only one way in which these material particles could influence each other, and that was by a collision or physical contact, a rather impoverished view of the capabilities of matter. So that when Descartes defined a mechanism, he was working with parts that couldn't do very much. That was one of the problems. Well, in the century that followed Descartes, some practitioners of what at the time was also called the new mechanical philosophy expanded the possibilities available to matter and material particles beyond Descartes' restricted vision. First, Boyle built a highly effective air pump and used this to demonstrate the possibility of a vacuum. Descartes had denied the possibility of a vacuum. Then Newton introduced the possibility of action at a distance. That means forces acting upon each other without direct physical contact. And in what came to be called the life sciences, mechanistic explanation, which was again explaining natural phenomena by identifying components and things that the components did, and then how they were put together so they did the kinds of things that we wanted to explain, became increasingly commonplace in the 18th and 19th century and ubiquitous in the 20th century. And in fact, along with the increasing use of the concept of mechanistic explanation, researchers began to attribute more and more properties to objects that could then be appealed to in mechanistic explanations. So such things as the creation and breaking of chemical bonds, the conduction of electric currents, magnetic forces, and so forth. But a funny thing happened in the physical sciences, because their greatest achievement seemed to lie in explaining activities in the natural world as regularities governed by laws of nature. And laws of nature were seen as powerful underlying generalizations, beginning with Newton's laws of motion in 1687, and later came things like the law of thermodynamics, electromagnetism, and so forth. These were all proper laws of nature. So in the 20th century, when philosophers turned their attention to the nature of scientific explanation, they were primarily influenced by the example of the physical sciences and focused their accounts on laws of nature. Again, any of you who lived through the middle of the 20th century will be very familiar with that. In fact, so when I was in college, when I was in graduate school, even into the 1990s, people were still talking about what was called the received view. And the received view focused on laws of nature and how laws of nature were properly used in giving scientific explanations. So here's how that works. This model of scientific explanation was developed by the logical positivists, also called logical empiricists, in the 1920s and 30s. And it dominated much of 20th century philosophy. And in fact, interesting thing was, one of the philosophers who was important in helping to construct the new mechanistic philosophy, as recently as 1988, he wrote that most of the doctrines of this view of science have been rejected, but the reason it persisted was there was no comprehensive, systematic alternative to replace the entire logical positivist vision of science and scientific explanation. And in fact, philosophers at the time were also, the way this works is just, okay, this was a model in which everything you're doing is working with statements, sentences, discursively. A law is thought of as a universal generalization. You write that down. Certain initial conditions. So let's take, as the example here, Newton's law of universal gravitation, which tells you something about how fast an object will fall and how it will accelerate depending on how far away it is from the center of the Earth. So you have this law, and then you have some object which is at a specified distance from the center of the Earth, and by a process of deduction, you arrive at the conclusion that the object will accelerate at a certain rate. So that was called nomological, from the Greek word nomos, it means law, and deductive, because it's a process of deduction and it depends on manipulating sentences. Well, what's ironic too is that this model of scientific explanation, which came to dominate the philosophy of science, happened during a period when mechanistic biology was achieving its greatest successes. And some philosophers began to discover in the 1990s that biologists rarely appealed to laws at all in scientific explanation. A major reason for this was there aren't any. Not that there aren't any, but they don't have the same status that they have in physics. And one of the things that happened to philosophers of science at that time was they took what was called a naturalistic turn. They began to pay attention not to what they thought it took to be epistemological principles derived from some kind of logical, some kind of system of logic or understanding of logic, and how sentences should relate to facts and so on. They undertook the process of, as an anthropologist would undertake, to see what scientists did, how they wrote in journals, how they worked together, how they talked at conferences and so forth. And what they found was mechanisms. That was a term that appeared all over the place, which Langer had also noted. And in fact, as the biologist Francis Crick, the co-discoverer with Watson of the structure of DNA, put it, what is found in biology is mechanisms. That's what he said. Anyway, there's a long tradition of looking for mechanisms that are responsible for the sorts of things that philosophers in the biological sciences are interested in. But it was only in the 1990s that some philosophers of biology began to focus on what was happening in biology, and that's when they discovered the widespread use of the term mechanism and mechanistic, but nobody had done anything with it. And there was no philosophical study of it, and that's what the new mechanism is about. One of the principal actors in this was William Bechtel, who had written some things before that, but his major work occurred in 1993 in a book he published with Robert Richardson, I believe it was at the University of Cincinnati. And the book is called Discovering Complexity, Decomposition and Localization as Strategies in Scientific Research. So what they came up with was a picture something like this. A mechanism is an identifiable system existing in the real world and consisting of, first of all, a number of distinguishable parts or components. Each of these parts perform various kinds of activities, operations, behaviors, whatever, and they interact with each other in some way to generate or produce the kinds of behaviors shown by the overall system. So in a mechanistic explanation, and they found that by doing a lot of research, again, as anthropologists, looking at the biological sciences, particularly in cell biology, this was the sort of thing that scientists were doing all the time. They located things that they thought were important parts, underlying some mechanism which was doing something of interest in the living system. They had to identify what each of them did. Then they had to show how the activity that they were trying to explain was a consequence of the nature of the parts, their organized interactions, and the context in which the mechanism functioned. Now, some of the components of a mechanism can themselves have highly structured can have complex internal structure, and so they in turn can be thought of as mechanisms if you want to dig deeper. Or you could go to a higher level, and the things identified as a mechanism whose parts you're interested in could themselves function as parts in a higher level mechanism, and that this hierarchical pattern could take you as far as you wanted, practically. So one of the things that Bechtel emphasized at the time his book came out, and what he continues to emphasize, let's see, are we here? No, we're not there yet, sorry, is that while people recognized that it was common to take a phenomenon, look at it, try to take it into pieces, apart into pieces, figure out what the pieces were doing, but often failed to notice that there was something about the way they were organized that was essential to explaining what the parts were doing. As he pointed out, because for human beings, the easiest way to think about what a number of things might do if they're cooperating in some way to produce an effect or a product is to think of an assembly line. We have a sequence of operations, of parts, each performs an operation, hands the product to the next component, which takes that, performs its operation, passes it on to the next component, and so forth. Now, one of the problems with that, he realized very early, was that there are phenomena of living things which critics of mechanistic explanation had, he said, rightly pointed out, which there was no mechanistic explanation for these kind of phenomena. And Bechtel argued that one of the reasons was because the scientists had been restricted to this sequential mode of organization because it was the easiest thing to work with, it's the easiest thing to imagine. And if you construct a model of this mechanism, you can visualize, you can draw a diagram of it, you can think about it, you can simulate it mentally as you imagine one thing going to the next, to the next. And so if you look at, for example, how proteins are synthesized by ribosomes in the cell, it's like first this happens, and that happens, and that happens, and that happens, and a protein comes out the end. And that's true enough. But there's a lot more going on, and you've abstracted a linear pathway from what's in fact a complex network of things that are intersecting with other pathways. So for example, let's see. Oh, I know what I wanted to do. So let's take this. So here's an example of the parts, a set of parts, 5 of them. You've named the activities they do, and you organize them sequentially, and you end up explaining what you want to explain. He said this is an even simpler way to give a mechanistic explanation. You find something in the mechanism which is doing all the work. One part you found is doing everything, so you don't have to take it apart anymore. But the next step up on this is a sequential organization where you have various inputs coming into the mechanism, boom, 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 and the output. However, and this is what's really interesting, he explains that there are several times in the history of science when people discovered and then discovered again what we think of and know as negative feedback, which is something like this. This is a principle behind James Watt's governor that he constructed to control the speed of steam engines in the 19th century. But there are much earlier examples in history. To control the speed of windmills, Bechtel mentions that. There was somebody in 500 BC who used negative feedback to construct a water clock. But nobody had yet recognized that this is some kind of important principle of organization. It was just kind of particular, we solved that problem, we solved that problem. But it was only with the cybernetics movement in the 1940s and 50s that the principle of negative feedback was raised to the level of an important principle. And in fact, cybernetics flourished around that. And a lot of explanations were given for behaviors which couldn't be accounted for until negative feedback had been appreciated. But what Bechtel emphasizes is that negative feedback is really the simplest departure from a straightforward sequential organization. That there are things which require much more complicated modes of organization, and that was things that biologists began to discover in the early part of the 20th century. There were things like positive feedback served a role, and anyone who's taken biology, even in high school, may remember what the Krebs cycle is. That's a process that's essential to the metabolic processes of the cell, where you have a chain of things coming down, starting with glucose, which is a common element in creating energy for the cell, moves through a sequence of changes, then it hands something off to an item that is part of a big circle of operations, and the operations start, they go around and around and around, they come back where they started from. But as a result of this activity, various things are thrown off at different points in the cycle, other things enter the cycle, and in fact, one of the things that happens is, if you've ever seen, and I have a slide, but this is what I was going to show you. One other thing I wanted to mention is, So this is a slightly more complex sort of mechanism where the things that are organized are influencing more than just the next thing in a sequence. They're influencing other parts, and they may in turn be influenced at the same time. Well, one of the things that's a problem about that is that human beings have a very hard time imagining what the mechanism is doing when it starts to get complicated like that. Many of the successes in the biological sciences up until the 20th century were with discovering and explaining sequential modes of operation, mechanisms that were organized sequentially and therefore could be visualized and understood intuitively. But when you get into more complex modes of organization, intuition breaks down. And so you're left not really understanding, in an intuitive way, how this mechanism is doing what you want it to do. The other thing that complicates things is something called, so there's sequential versus non-sequential organization. There's also a difference between linear and nonlinear relationships. This is mathematicians understand what this is, but I didn't. Because they're using a term, again, in a technical sense. So why is that a nonlinear relationship? It has a line. It's not straight, though. That's the thing, see? Because what happens in a linear relationship means you do something, you intervene, you impact the system in some way, a certain effect occurs. If you double the amount of impact, the effect is doubled. If you triple the impact, the effect is tripled. You know, there's that kind of proportional relationship, which is, oops, I'm sorry. Which again is relatively easy to understand. But when you're dealing with a nonlinear relationship, like the relationship between the radius and area of a circle, if you double the radius, the area is squared. It's multiplied by itself. If you triple it, it's cubed. You know, and so how that sort of a relationship is going to behave when you change inputs to it is, again, not very intuitive for most people. You have to, in this case, you know, you need to come up with a graph, take measurements, and so forth to properly understand and appreciate what certain kinds of interferences, interventions, and so forth are going to affect, how they're going to affect the mechanism. Oh, and in fact, what happens is, as the organization of the system increases in importance, becomes less, what the whole is doing becomes less and less easy to understand. So what you have then is, you can reach a point when, you know, here we were talking about a network like this, still not that complicated, but it gets to be a strain to figure out what's happening. But if you, and this is the sort of networks that biologists are dealing with now, right? So here is a mechanism for generating circadian rhythms in mammals. And this apparently recurs in a number of species. So it's widely distributed. And what these are components, right? Each of which is a fairly complex biochemical, having a structure of some kind and characteristic modes of action, activity, influence, and so on. But you can see, right, that the arrows of influence are going back and forth and around and so forth, far from a straight sequence of operations. And then what happens is that mechanism itself is, oops, let's see if I can, is situated, that's this area, and this is reproduced here in this dotted line. And what you have is a whole bunch of other components which are affecting this mechanism, and in turn being affected by it. Impossible to understand it without some kind of computer model. So what you have is, and this is one of the things that began to appear at the end of the 1990s, when biologists had access to much higher powered computers and were therefore able to construct mathematical models using large numbers of differential equations, and then constructing the computer model from that, and then running the model on a computer so as to simulate the behavior of the mechanism and then make adjustments if it didn't match the behavior of the thing you're trying to study. And when the model successfully simulates many of the changes that you're tracking and the effects that result of it, then you can say you have an understanding of the mechanism, even though you have no intuitive grasp of what's going on. And that's the direction that biology is moving in, increasingly, because, you know, the story of the 20th century is like a great parts hunt. You know, the triumphs of biology, especially in the second half of the 20th century, was finding out all kinds of things and what they were composed of. You know, got the structure of DNA. You began to look at, you unraveled all of these various metabolic pathways, identified each component. Each of these chemical reactions has an enzyme. You were able to identify that and its structure and how it behaves and so forth, until you end up with, well, you know, you have a proteome. What's a proteome? Well, a proteome is just the parts list of all the proteins in a cell, for example. A genome is just a parts list. It's a list of all the things that make up the genetic material. And the parts lists grow to at such a rate that they can, in fact, there's, you know, research methods to automate the unraveling of complex structures in order to end up with a parts list. Well, by the end of as I said, when I was writing my dissertation at the end of the 90s, people were starting to voice dissatisfaction. They had a sense that, okay, for a lot of this, for decades now, we've been dreaming of successfully identifying all the base pairs in a genome. And when we do that, we'll have the secret of life. Except as they got closer and closer to that goal, they began to realize, okay, we've got a heap of parts. Now, what are they doing? And the only way you can start to figure that kind of question out is this way. And that requires a major shift in the paradigm of biological research. And this is what's interesting. So these are the number of articles indexed in PubMed every year that were labeled systems biology. Starting in 2001, 25 years ago, 2009, it only goes up. But you can see a tremendous increase. And let's see, the gold dashed line shows, the total number of articles indexed in PubMed during that year. So you also get some sense of what percentage of articles were about systems biology. And systems biology works with these kinds of networks. You know, it tries to develop mechanistic models. But the kinds of mechanisms that come out of that sort of modeling don't behave anything like Cartesian mechanisms. And so, you know, the word mechanism has just, the meaning of it has actually changed, but the widespread common understanding of what a mechanism is has still persists. And so you have that kind of conflict, which makes it difficult to talk about, but it's nonetheless mechanistic explanation. That's why Stuart Glennon calls it, and others have called it the new mechanical philosophy. Now, one of the things that Langer says when she talks about acts is she says that the act form, you know, which has these distinguishable phases, right? There's the impulse and the acceleration, consummation, there's the coda, and she said that that's not enough to distinguish a true act because there are plenty of things in inanimate nature which show the act form. And in fact, she mentions what happens if you pour baking soda into a glass of lemonade or lemon juice and water. You start off, you know, it's quiet. Lemon juice is very quiet, and lemonade. You pour in some baking soda, then you get this foam. You know, this foam up, and it'll rise really quickly. It'll start to accelerate. It gets bigger and bigger, and then it starts to quiet down, you know. And then it ends when the reaction reaches equilibrium. So what you have is, and this is funny, I wasn't able to find, this was the only graph I could find in which time was graphed against the rate of the reaction. Most of the graphs of this reaction were tracking the volume, cumulative volume of gas that was produced, right? And so then you get something like this. It just goes up and levels off. This is something that displays the act form. But you have to be graphing the rate of the reaction. You see what happens is the rate of the reaction accelerates. Then it reaches a climax, then it levels off a bit and starts to slow down until it reaches equilibrium. So what Langer is saying is, so, you know, Langer said, in fact, here's the quotation that our previous speaker read, organic activities have dynamic forms. So do some inorganic activities. But one of the things that the new mechanistic biology makes possible, and the kinds of mechanisms that they're able to construct computer models of, is looking at the sorts of dynamic forms displayed by various kinds of sets of organic activities that are interrelated in some way. And so what I see happening is, you know, even if these activities that are being studied don't all show the same sort of act form that Langer thought they did, they're at least showing a variety of dynamic forms, and we're looking at dynamic forms. And that's one of the major directions in biological research that sort of, I think about it as, you know, realizing some of Langer's intuitions, that the science required analytic units that were events, and the events showed some kind of characteristic dynamic form. Well, that's what I see happening in systems biology, among many things. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your patience. Any questions?
Obviously, Don can handle his own questions, so I leave it to him.
A whole bunch of questions, thank you for this, but I'm trying to limit myself to one, so others get a chance. Here you've got definitely a non-linear graph. It's not a very complicated one, it's a polynomial function of some kind, but your first two were linear and quadratic. And it seems to me that if you think in terms of Langerian forms, you're thinking of, try music as an art form to capture the form we're looking at.
Uh-huh.
You're looking at somebody playing on the lute or the lyre. Here you're looking at performance of Mahler's symphony by a large orchestra by contract. But in other words, the models, the concepts in the mind of the experimenter are way too simple for the phenomenon they're trying to investigate, which seemed to be the thrust of your remark, and also of hers. You need to find the right images in art. It can't be some trivial, simple, simplistic piece of art. It needs to be a very complicated one to match the complexity of the system you're trying to image. What?
In fact, there's a good quote from Langer at the end of the chapter that precedes the chapter in which she introduces the act concept. She ends up saying, she's been talking 4 chapters on art,
Right.
This orienting function, she said. And then she says, well, but no matter how complex art may seem, it's a lot simpler than real life.
Yeah, right.
And so now we turn to that question.
So the virtual reality that is the space of the art object, say the plastic art, the painting, Van Gogh's Starry Night or something, and you can enter into that world, you can see the complexity there, but it's still simpler than the complexity of even a Newtonian or Galilean, astronomical phenomenon that they're looking at, or at least possibly so. And that's what she's trying to get at, to say that's how you try to build models that will capture the relevant, respective complexity of the system before you, and the acts that take place within it.
Yeah, and she talks about, the grasping, the apprehension we have of artistic form is an intuitive grasping. We don't go through a process of discursive thinking to get to it. So it's like, I guess she would say, we're blessed with, we have this insatiable curiosity as a species, but we're blessed with the ability, some people to create works of art, others to appreciate works of art, and now Langer comes along and says, you know what? You could use this understanding.
It's amazing.
To
really amazing.
Start to, scratch the surface of the mysteries of subjective experience within the framework of biological sciences.
It's fabulous.
Yeah, it really, it's amazing.
Fabulous.
Yes.
John, that was a wonderful presentation. Langer says at the beginning of Mind that she wants to avoid metaphysics, and no matter how much she loved Whitehead, and Whitehead perhaps loved her, she wasn't going to go in that route. But it's very clear that underlying what the background conditions of your presentation skirts the, and Langer did too, skirts the real issue of emergence, because there is, the act form is an emergent phenomenon. And I remember when the first volume came out, Peter Petrucci wrote a scathing review of Langer in the Review of Metaphysics, saying that this was a vicious concept that was contradictory, and he could not build any type of theory, that she was doing a theory of mind on the basis of it. I wonder what you would say to that, because it seems that very clear the act form in the human instance is an example of emergence. That is, the great transition to human mentality is a cosmic emergence from that point of view. It's a cosmic event. It's an event of nature. So I wonder how, but that's also been a metaphysical play.
Right.
How would we be able to reconcile the denial and the result? It seems to me.
Well, that's an interesting question, really interesting, because if you start to read some of the works of the new mechanists, especially William Bechtel and Stuart Glenn, but Bechtel is my hero. He's been doing this kind of work since the 1980s. And he, was like a bloodhound. He was on it. And he's been just, a few steps ahead of other people in pushing the idea of what this mechanistic explanation means. He was the person who started emphasizing the idea of the importance of organization and exploring how complex organization modifies how the parts themselves interact with each other, for example. But so to bring up your question, he and other philosophers who were interested in this kind of explanation believe that the idea of emergence is something that can be accounted for, and it doesn't involve something unnatural. What happens is, and there's a couple of things that are getting in the way of understanding what emergence means, and I think one of them is, when I showed you that what the deductive nomological explanation, the philosophers who came up with that also had an account of what they called reduction. What does reduction mean? Well, because the entities, the explanatory entities that they were dealing with were theories. Theories took the form of statements or sentences. The relationships between theories were thought of as logical also, in that sense of propositional logic. So the problem could be, it would raise the specter of, okay, suppose that on my model I say that there's a theory in physics, and I find I can explain it in terms of a lower level theory, and that in terms of a lower level theory, and if the relationship between these theories is one of logical deduction, then by definition, the lowest level theory has all the information contained in the upper level theories, because the relation is logical deduction, right? And when you start with a set of premises, anything you derive from those premises was already implicit in the premises, right? You just pull it out by logical deduction. Well, if you don't depend primarily on statements for theories any longer, if you realize you have to work with models, the relationship between models, first off, is not a deductive relationship. And when you're looking at parts of models and parts of models and so forth, you start to understand that, one of the things that Bechtel and similar writers say all the time is that when you move, that levels, for example, when you're talking about levels, are always locally defined within a mechanism. It's not a question of like universal levels. Chemistry is one level, and then there's physics, there's another level. It goes throughout the universe. You start with a particular mechanism that you're trying to understand. You may find, I have to go down one level to understand what's going on. Maybe I have to go down another level. Maybe I go up a level. And each of them gives me information that the other level doesn't have. And the only way you can represent that information is diagrammatically or through a computer model. And those levels are not redundant then. It's not like there's a lowest level that contains all the information you need to understand the phenomenon. Right. So that kind of reduction disappears in that picture.
Right.
You have reduction in the sense that, so they say, yeah, there's reduction. What you're doing is you're looking at lower and lower, more detail. You're unpacking the detail and getting a richer view of the phenomenon. But you need all those different levels to get an adequate account of what you're interested in understanding. You can't eliminate any of the levels in favor of some lowest level or whatever.
Right.
So in that sense, you could talk about emergence, he says, because certain parts will behave in ways that you can't predict from knowledge of how they behave by themselves if the organization allows them to.
Right.
Or if they join in a certain way, then they start doing things, the vocabulary you're using to describe what they're doing under this condition of organization, where they're influencing each other in complicated ways, and build a computer model to understand it. It's a different, you need a different language at each level. And the language is not something you eliminate as you move to a lower level. So I think the common understanding or fear of what reduction means comes from the logical, from the logical empirical model, empiricist model of how theories are related to one another and that kind of reduction. This is a different kind of reduction, and it doesn't have, I don't think, the same, doesn't raise some of the same kinds of, fears. The idea that, all the richness that we know at this level is going to disappear because I can get it all from here. I don't know, does that speak to what you're... Yeah.
Don Wang Ji is just dying.
Okay, sorry, I'll get you.
Hi, Wang Ji here, working composer. Since you evoked Mahler here, well, music theorists has been the reductionists in the musicology world forever, and I was really struck when I was in first year of graduate school and Jonathan Dunsby, we took apart. Mahler's last words were Mozart. So we took apart something Mozart just whipped up, like probably as a mental verb, and we analyzed it to death, and then we analyzed it more to death, and then as if it could die again. And it was like the Russian doll, and then you just keep discovering, you keep inventing new ways to look at why these few notes by this man is greater than like the Second Symphony of Mahler or something like that.
Oh,
something
Solari,
like that.
where
But
are you?
but what really struck me was that at the end of it, at the end of analysis, and what he said was, since we've reached the end of the analysis, what is the solution? The solution is to analyze more, to analyze even more. Now, as a working composer, I'll tell you that what I leave on the page. Let's just suppose that nature or the universe is the composer of biology. What I leave on the page for people to see is just what I leave on the page. The 55 things I eliminated that I don't put in the page, nobody will know. I don't even know all the time. What about that data point? What you're able to collect, the theorists are able to collect from just a few simple notes by Mozart, or, actually people have tried to analyze my music. I was like, please don't. And because we leave out so much, because our intuition is trained in a certain way. So what about the things, the majority, like every decision I make that I put on the page, that means I have eliminated at least when I'm good at it, when I'm good. When I was not good, I can see 3 options and I pick the best one. When I got better, I can see 7. At this stage, I can automatically, in less than a split second, eliminate 30, maybe. And at this rate, how much information do you think that I would just eliminate and just produce this one page of music? That is an insane amount of so-called data point for this system.
Right.
Just something for you to, I love your talk and how it began. And it's just something I think about all the time when I'm doing scholarly work. So this is actually deeply frustrating for me to sit through. I feel more connected with the universe, who's the ultimate composer for our biology. I can relate to this process. When I was a young theorist, I was also breaking down everything, decomposing, as if they're not already decomposing under the ground. The decomposing the composer's works.
Yeah, see, I'm not sure I understand, because I don't understand enough about the arts and what process, what people like that you're talking about go through when they analyze a work of art. And what, I might have to say about that, or imagining what Langer would say about that kind of analysis. I don't know. I think of this as a very different sort of analysis than, what somebody does with a work of art. But I don't really understand a lot about that kind of analysis at all. So, but it sounds like in some ways you're reacting to this in certain ways that are similar to the way you react to the process of
Yes.
analyzing your piece of music.
When I was trying to analyze, when I was trying to get to the point of how is it that a few notes by Mozart seemed alive, seems like he was creating living forms, versus I was creating corpses or objects or a note churning machine.
Okay.
And so because the way composers are taught are very much through analysis, and we literally break down everything to even the notes, the tiny, the most insignificant, minuscule elements of music, and then we try to put it back together. Good luck, but
See, now that's interesting, put it back together, because one of the things that Bechtel repeatedly emphasizes is he says you don't really understand the mechanism until you can put it back together. In other words, you have to what he calls recompose. You've decomposed it, now you have to recompose. That's a test of your understanding in this case. But see, I don't know whether there's a parallel in music at all. So I feel like I'm up against a wall here. I don't know how to respond to you in a way that, reaches into your experience, from my
I also
experience.
feel like I'm hitting a wall when the so-called decomposition process is involved. At least in my world, and I hope my talk tomorrow can at least begin the conversation about this, because from my end, the mechanical process is the dead end to the living form that I try to create.
But it's totally reductive, right? I mean, and
Well, reductive,
Yeah.
in a sense of it's, it seems to be, I'm just thinking, my example, I guess the closest example I come to, I've, listened to Keith Jarrett talk about the process he goes through, and when he just, all right, I'm going to walk on stage, now I'm going to sit down, and I'm going to play something, and I played for 4 hours. I had no idea what I was going to play when I sat down, but I was in the process, and it just kept going and going and going. So I guess my question would be, what this makes me think of is, what are composers supposed to get out of this analytic activity? I can see how, somebody who's an academic, student of music, who has the ability to do this might find it fascinating or whatever. But does the creative person gain anything from that? I don't know the answer to that. Seems like, when I think of how Keith Jarrett seems to create at the piano, he's not going through anything.
Clearly not.
Yeah. No, that was just a
Thanks.
second.
And thank you for the talk. And to maybe follow up, I'm wondering, would Langer say that's exactly what you can't do with art, is to kind of decompose, break it down into separate terms that kind of exist independently, and then but it has to kind of develop organically in this way, and so the composer might not get anything from this kind of analytical process. And this was something I was having a little difficult understanding too, and I haven't read mine yet. But how we can intuitively grasp the art symbol, right, and that it has this kind of organic living form, that has this very complex dynamic interaction with all the parts creating this whole that we can grasp, that we can perceive, that we can apprehend. But so how is that? So how how is that understanding then that we had, that insight that we had from that form, it's not scientific, right? But that is supposed to be the image, not the model, she said,
Right.
that science uses then to, I guess, create models that we would then be able to analyze, decompose, and understand these mechanisms.
Okay, that's it. Here's, oops, damn. But this reminds me of, I feel like the emperor who has no clothes on, because ever since I was first read Philosophy in a New Key, I was 22 years old, so that's like 60 years ago. And it was very exciting because it seemed to make sense out of art, but I had no idea how to approach a work of art in any way that would give me the kinds of things that she says she sees in art. So I say, well, what am I doing talking so much about how enthusiastic I am about Langer and how she does this and that and so forth, and I don't really have an experiential basis in the arts to do that. Somehow it feels right, what she says, but I don't know what it's like, because she talks about, you're analyzing the process. How does the artist achieve this effect? And what are the problem do they encounter here? And how do they solve it? And so forth. I have no idea what that means. None.
It's not the difference between model and image, that the model explains how something works and an image shows how something appears. So therefore, what your analysis talk about is a different kind of...
Yeah, I would agree with this. I mean, her notion of analysis is not breaking into parts. It never was.
Right.
I would regard it as a logical point. And I'm wondering how much she read Turing, because she would have understood Turing and Gödel is showing there's no system of all systems.
Okay.
So she never had a nomological, deductive, that hypothetical. She was
That's right.
not trained in that model. Shepard did not teach logic to them that way. They always
Right.
saw science as creative. And from James, to go back, I love this talk, the beginning about James, they begin with the intuitive feeling. Science is essentially a creative process, and you can see that in all the student logic notes from the logic courses she took from him. What she's dealing with is second order form. So she's not talking about properties of objects, or properties of notations, or even properties of concepts. What she's looking for is structural forms, gestalt forms that let you take in these things. And I must say with Turing, it's very strict. Turing saw exactly the most important thing, given his decidability results, is you need to have human phraseology and sense making to take this stuff in. And he predicted that that would be the most important thing with artificial intelligence. So it's higher order form, and it's not really, I agree with Adrian, it's not really analysis in the sense we learn about breaking into parts where we go through these. It's the multiple decompositionality.
I mean, I know she talks about what you're looking at is you're looking at the semblance is what you're trying to understand, articulate it in some way. And she talks about how you're distinguishing within this, dynamic whole elements which can't be removed from it and things like that. But, for me, confronting any work of art, that language that she uses doesn't reflect anything I've ever experienced about art. That I feel like, there's a certain blindness, a kind of closed limitation that I have that I can't go that far.
Yeah, but Don, you've probably seen a painting that just blew you away, or heard a production and it's just like, oh my God.
Oh, sure. I mean, I was.
Science God, that never happens.
Come on!
I always responded to classical music ever since I was a kid, so. But right, I have responses to music and painting and so forth. I could say it's like, well, I know what I like, basically.
Oh my God.
But to follow, to imagine thinking about or reacting to the way Langer is apparently reacting to works of art and making all these discoveries, which she says that she can see, that works of art rise to the level of entire human personalities, and she talks about, and I don't think she's deluded. I think I just don't have it, you know, and I know that. So, but it's kind of, I feel a little sheepish, you know, when I say, oh, I don't understand art either, but this sounds pretty good.
Can I just say that, not that I'm a full-time scholar or in any sense, but reading Langer was the first time as a working artist. You know, I've been doing this for 40 years. And it was the first time I felt that what I do, which I don't even understand very well, that could be understood, and then she understood something about it. And this was really, this was a milestone moment for my artistic life. To not feel so alone.
That's great. It's great. It's great.
I'm not saying that everything she wrote, and I tried to read everything she wrote, that resonated with me, but just just whatever you presented today, it makes perfect sense to me. You know, there are these pieces by Mozart or Bach. You take out one note, the whole piece falls apart. One note, and it's something that I think. I hope that I cover some of it in my talk tomorrow. It's this process that generates from my body, from my feeling, that is purely biological. But it's also not devoid of architectural and science and training and logic. It's a combination of a lot of things that don't even have names, that don't even have terminology to describe. Cannot be measured, and it's not like you're gonna put me into an MRI machine and have me pose for an hour. You're gonna have any conclusion or observation about how this goes every day in my composing studio.
Right.
All the decisions I make to not do something. So I just want to put this out here, and I loved your talk. Thank you so much.
You know, I don't know, have you talked to Caroline? Caroline?
Well,
She's giving a talk.
It's coming up.
There's a famous, she'll tell you about it, I guess. I hadn't heard of it. No, I did hear about it, I guess, but I didn't know much about it. It was 1952, did you say? Woodstock. There was a conference at Woodstock, the infamous Woodstock, which was an artist colony. But anyway, several modern painters came together with philosophers, and they had a conversation, and Langer was there. And it was at that conference that one of the painters, who's quite well known, was it Barnett Newman? Was his name? Okay, I don't know much about the history of art, but anyway, he was the one who said, and you might have heard this, what was it, that that philosophy of art was as useful to creative artists as ornithology is to birds.
There you go.
But he also claimed to have painted the sublime, and so, you know, you gotta take that with a grain of salt.
So there is something about
scratch my talk tomorrow because I do find Langer helpful.
No, there are artists who say the opposite. Newman is not painting. I mean, Newman thinks
But that
Well,
generalization.
Leo's an artist, by the way, and he now
The
wants to say
arts.
something.
come from the same thought processes as the sciences. In fact, we can take painting and poetry and say, and you have the Tura poesy, like painting, like poetry. One can extrapolate that to the sciences. For a scientist to do research is observing the world around, all the physical processes. The artist is doing the same thing. The poet is doing the same thing. The musician is doing the same thing. So, I think there are bases from which one can take this as a wellspring and develop, and I think Langer has done that. Put it in a context with which one can go along and deal with all these processes.
This is expressive form in Langer. That's what Leo's talking about. And you know, here's what Don is going to say. I don't have any experience of expressive form that I can make sense of, because, well, I mean, you're sort of denying that this aesthetic, but it's more than that, this feeling sensitivity, you're denying that it's present in all of us in such a way as to elaborate it, right? But it's certainly present in some of us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it just doesn't have to be your history.
And
Right.
is the problem that like a discursive understanding isn't readily available? And so I don't think that's what she's saying. I think like if you have this, insight, right? If you have this kind of there's something resonating, or there's something there that's captured or imaged, like that seems to be enough, I think. And then to articulate it discursively can get very tricky. It's how I'm seeing these
Very much.
It wants to be discursive, but it has a lot of difficulty in becoming so.
Right.
Well, and you can go back and forth. You do discursive model making for a while, and then you go back to just the experience of resonance and reaction, right?
Semblance.
See, what I'm waiting for, I guess, is somebody who comes along, a philosopher or somebody else, hopefully a philosopher or a philosopher scientist, who says, I never thought of that before, but I see what Langer is talking about, and now I'm discovering all these things about living things that I didn't see. I wasn't aware of them, but I'm using my understanding of my implicit understanding of art and and my responses and what I see in the semblance or hear in the semblance to discover new things about living things. And that's what she's saying, and I don't have that experience, and I haven't run across anyone else, because she was saying, okay, there's this, works of art give us forms of feeling of the whole range of subjectivity. And we can learn all kinds of things about subjectivity. And then we can turn around and use that understanding that we have. I'm not going to say it's a discursive understanding, but we can use that in some way, access it, and use it as a measure as we're trying to do this scientific work and the philosophic work of constructing the concepts that we need to understand this thing that we have access to through the arts. But I don't have access to it. In the same, I don't have an experience of, now I'm seeing things, I'm aware of things. Presumably, Langer wasn't a complete singularity. There's got to be somebody who's going to come along.
Sounds like you need to explore some indigenous philosophies.
I don't know, who can follow, pick up the ball and carry it in some way. I mean, all these developments that I was talking about in the sciences, Langer didn't influence any of that. It's just, I see them as going in a similar direction when she talks about, when people talk about, we're exploring now the dynamic structure of events in these networks, biochemical networks, and so forth.
But she wrote about that so poetically in mind. There's a, rhythm upon rhythm within rhythm, and she didn't have a research lab. Take a look at this, But I think, the point is there's so much going on at the same time, and she had a sense of that. I mean,
she didn't do any research, but she read voluminously in the biological sciences, and she took courses from, the woman in Connecticut College. She was the biology professor, and so she had contact with it. She didn't do her own research, but she said, you can't. Like she put it, she says, if somebody writes a great deal about mind without becoming a psychologist, we can expect their doctrine of being sterile. And I think she was applying that to herself. I'm writing about biology, I'm writing about life, and she said, I don't know anything about it. I'm 61 years old, I got to go back to school. And then she started doing all this, again, following that dictum. If somebody writes a lot about biological topics, but they're not a biologist, then there's something wrong with what they're writing, probably, because you have to have all of this So she was deliberately, you know, trying to mix it up with this material and dig into it in some way and look for maybe not the same thing that a researcher would be looking for,
You
but
know, all of it comes together with a sense of livingness. You know, what is that? And we're all alive, and we, you know, we just do it without completely understanding. I mean, obviously, you know, like, how is it that we're all alive?
Well, speak for yourself.
All right, and on that note.